The air inside the Singapore to New York flight buzzed with that electric hum only an 18-hour journey could muster, a cocktail of anticipation exhaustion. And the faint clink of champagne flutes from the first-class cabin. At 35,000 feet, the plane sliced through the night sky, a sleek metal beast carrying 300 souls across continents. Most passengers had already settled into their seats, some flipping through glossy magazines, others slipping on noise-canceling headphones, ready to drown out the world. But up front, in the rarefied air of first class, a different kind of tension was brewing, one that nobody saw coming. Lydia Tran stepped aboard with the kind of quiet confidence that didn't demand attention but somehow claimed it anyway. At 42, she didn't look like your typical first-class passenger. No diamond-crusted watch, no designer handbag slung over her shoulder. Just a simple cashmere sweater and tailored jeans that whispered money without screaming it. Her dark hair was pulled back in a loose bun, a single strand falling free as she adjusted her scarf and slid into seat 1A, the throne of the cabin, the spot reserved for the elite of the elite. She didn't fuss with her carry-on or summon a flight attendant with a snap of her fingers. She just sat, calm as still water, and reached for the in-flight menu with a faint, unreadable smile. Sophie Nguyen, on the other hand, ruled the first-class cabin like it was her personal kingdom. At 37, with 7 years of sky-high experience under her belt, she'd perfected the art of reading people, or so she thought. Her uniform was pristine, every crease ironed to a razor's edge, her auburn hair pinned up in a tight twist that screamed control. She moved down the aisle with sharp, deliberate steps, her heels clicking like a metronome against the carpeted floor. To her, this wasn't just a job, it was a performance. She flashed a rehearsed smile at a silver-haired businessman in 2B, leaning in to offer him a glass of Dom Perignon with a soft laugh at his predictable joke. Then she pivoted to a woman in a Chanel suit, cooing over her choice of orange juice with a splash of vodka. Sophie knew how to make people feel important when she wanted to. But when her eyes landed on Lydia in 1A, something shifted. The smile didn't fade, not exactly, but it tightened, like a mask slipping just enough to reveal the cracks beneath. Sophie paused, her gaze flicking over Lydia's understated outfit, the lack of flashy accessories, the way she sat there so unassuming. In Sophie's mind, first class was for power players, CEOs with private jets on speed dial, celebrities hiding behind oversized sunglasses. This woman, she didn't fit the mold. Sophie's instincts kicked in, the ones she'd honed over years of sizing up passengers. Does she even belong here? Did she snag this seat on some discount loophole? Lydia didn't notice or didn't care. She flipped a page in the menu, then set it down, her fingers brushing the armrest as she glanced up. "Excuse me," she said, her voice low and polite, cutting through the hum of the cabin like a blade through silk. "Could I have a glass of water?" It was the simplest request imaginable. No fuss, no flair, just water. But to Sophie, it was a spark igniting a fuse. She stopped mid-step, turning slowly to face Lydia, her head tilting just enough to signal disbelief. A beat of silence stretched between them, thick and heavy, as Sophie's lips curved into a smirk that didn't reach her eyes. "Water," she repeated, her tone dripping with condescension. "If you wanted water, economy's that way." She jerked her thumb toward the back of the plane, a gesture sharp enough to slice the air. "This is first class. We serve champagne, cocktails, the good stuff. Pick something worthy of the seat." The cabin went quiet, or at least it felt that way to the handful of passengers close enough to hear. A businessman in 3A lowered his tablet, his eyebrows lifting slightly. A woman across the aisle froze with her glass halfway to her lips, sensing the shift in the atmosphere. Lydia didn't flinch. She didn't raise her voice or snap back. She just looked at Sophie, her dark eyes steady, unblinking, like she was studying a puzzle she'd already solved. Then, with a slow, deliberate motion, she reached into her pocket and pulled out her phone. Her thumb hovered over the screen for a split second before she tapped it once, the faint glow illuminating her face. Sophie didn't catch the gesture, not yet. She crossed her arms, shifting her weight to one hip, her smirk widening. "What, no preference? Fine. I'll bring you a mimosa. You'll thank me later." She turned on her heel, dismissing Lydia entirely, her heels clicking triumphantly as she strutted back toward the galley. She'd won this round, or so she thought. First class was her domain, and no one was going to challenge her authority over something as trivial as a glass of water. But Lydia wasn't done. She leaned back in her seat, the phone still in her hand, her fingers moving swiftly now. The screen flickered as she opened the camera app, tilted it just so, and pressed record. The tiny red dot blinked to life, capturing everything: the aisle, the seats, the faint murmur of passengers, and Sophie, oblivious, marching away like a queen who just crushed a peasant uprising. In the galley, Hannah Lou watched it all unfold. 25. She was the rookie of the crew, still green enough to flinch at Sophie's sharp tongue but sharp enough to know something was off. She'd been shadowing Sophie for months, learning the ropes, biting her lip through every snapped order and cutting remark. Now she stood frozen, a bottle of chilled water in her hand, her stomach twisting as she replayed Sophie's words in her head. Water's for economy? It didn't make sense. It was just water. She glanced at Lydia, saw the phone angled subtly in her lap, and felt a prickle of unease crawl up her spine. Sophie burst into the galley a second later, her face flushed with victory. "Can you believe that?" she hissed, grabbing a tray and slamming a flute of champagne onto it. Some people think they can waltz into first class and order like they're at a fast food counter. Ridiculous. She didn't wait for Hannah to respond. She never did. Just spun back toward the aisle, ready to deliver her upgrade to Lydia and prove her point. Hannah stayed rooted to the spot, her grip tightening on the water bottle. She didn't know who Lydia was, not yet. But she knew one thing for sure: Sophie had just lit a match in a room full of gasoline. And as the plane soared deeper into the night, that tiny flame was about to ignite something no one, not even Sophie, could control. The first-class cabin hummed with the kind of artificial calm that only existed at cruising altitude, a fragile bubble of luxury stretched tight over the rumble of jet engines. The lights were dimmed now, casting soft golden pools over polished wood accents and plush leather seats. Passengers sipped their drinks, some murmuring to seamates, others lost in their own worlds. But beneath the surface, a storm was brewing, and Sophie Nguyen was about to throw the first lightning bolt. She strutted back down the aisle, tray in hand. The champagne flute balanced with the precision of a tightrope walker. Her smirk hadn't faded; if anything, it had sharpened, fueled by the thrill of putting Lydia Tran in her place. To Sophie, this wasn't just a drink, it was a statement. "You don't belong here, and I decide what you get." She stopped at seat 1A, towering over Lydia with all the confidence of a queen addressing a subject. "Here you go," she said, her voice syrupy with mock sweetness. "A mimosa. Much better than plain old water." "You're welcome." Lydia didn't look up right away. She sat there, legs crossed, her phone still resting lightly in her lap, the red dot of the recording blinking steadily. The faint glow caught Sophie's eye for a split second, but she dismissed it, probably just another entitled passenger texting about their horrible flight. Lydia's fingers paused on the armrest, then she lifted her gaze, locking eyes with Sophie. "I asked for water," she said, her tone even, almost too calm, like the still air before a tornado touches down. Sophie's smirk twitched. She let out a short, incredulous laugh, loud enough to turn a few heads nearby. "Seriously? You're still on about that?" She shifted the tray to one hand, gesturing with the other like she was swatting away a fly. "Look, lady, this is first class. We don't do basic here. Take the mimosa or don't. I've got better things to do than play fetch for you." The words landed like a slap, sharp and deliberate. A businessman in 3A coughed into his fist, hiding a grin. A woman in a tailored blazer across the aisle raised an eyebrow, her cocktail glass hovering midair. Lydia didn't flinch. She tilted her head slightly, studying Sophie with that same unreadable stare, then said, "Interesting choice." Her voice was quiet, but it carried a weight that made the hair on the back of Sophie's neck prickle. Before Sophie could fire back, Lydia adjusted her phone, angling it just enough to catch Sophie's face in the frame. That's when Sophie snapped. She didn't know why. Maybe it was the calm defiance in Lydia's eyes. Maybe it was the way the other passengers were watching, waiting for her next move. Whatever it was, it pushed her over the edge. "Oh, you think you're clever?" she hissed, her voice dropping low and venomous. She slammed the tray down on the empty seat next to Lydia, the mimosa sloshing over the rim. Then, in a move no one saw coming, not even herself, she grabbed the glass, jerked it forward, and accidentally tipped it right onto Lydia's lap. Orange juice splashed across Lydia's sweater, soaking the soft cashmere in a sticky neon stain. A gasp rippled through the cabin. The businessman in 3A bolted upright, his tablet clattering to the floor. "What the hell?" he barked, his voice cutting through the stunned silence. The woman with the cocktail set her glass down hard, her jaw dropping. Lydia froze for a split second, the cold liquid seeping through her jeans, then slowly lifted her head. Her expression didn't change. No shock, no anger. Just that same eerie calm. The phone in her hand didn't waver. The red dot kept blinking. Sophie's heart thudded in her chest, but she doubled down, plastering a fake smile over her panic. "Oh my God, I'm so sorry," she said, her tone dripping with sarcasm. She snatched a napkin from the tray and tossed it onto Lydia's lap like it was trash. "Guess my hand slipped. Must be all these ridiculous requests throwing me off." She straightened up, brushing her hands together as if wiping away the mess she'd made, and turned to walk away. Let her deal with that, she thought, her heels clicking triumphantly against the floor. But she didn't get far. From the galley, Hannah Lou had seen everything, the request, the refusal, the spill, and she couldn't take it anymore. 25. She was still new enough to feel the sting of Sophie's arrogance every day, but old enough to know right from wrong. She grabbed a chilled bottle of water from the storage bin, her hands trembling slightly, and marched toward Lydia's seat. "Here, ma'am," she said softly, setting the bottle on Lydia's tray table with a quiet clink. "Let me know if you need anything else." Her voice wavered, but her eyes flicked toward Sophie, daring her to say something. Sophie spun around so fast her ponytail whipped the air. Her eyes locked on the bottle, then on Hannah. And something inside her snapped like a taut wire. "What do you think you're doing?" she snarled, storming back toward them. Before Hannah could answer, Sophie lunged forward, snatched the bottle from the tray, and without a second thought, hurled it to the floor. The plastic cracked open with a loud pop, water exploding across the carpet in a glistening arc. A child in 4B shrieked, startled by the noise, and her mother shot up, furious. "Are you insane?" the woman yelled, clutching her sobbing daughter. "What's wrong with you?" The cabin erupted. Passengers twisted in their seats, some standing to get a better look, others whispering furiously to their neighbors. The businessman in 3A slammed his fist on his armrest. "This is outrageous. Get the captain down here." The woman in the blazer pulled out her own phone, filming the chaos with a grim smile. Sophie stood there, chest heaving. Her perfect uniform now speckled with water droplets, her control slipping through her fingers like sand. She opened her mouth to shout something, anything, but the words died in her throat when she saw Lydia. Lydia hadn't moved. She sat there, soaked in orange juice, the napkin crumpled in her lap. Her phone still recording every second of Sophie's meltdown. Then slowly she stood. The cabin fell silent, all eyes on her as she stepped into the aisle. Her presence suddenly towering despite her modest frame. Her voice, when it came, was steel wrapped in silk. "I want to see the captain," she said, each word precise, deliberate. A guillotine blade poised to drop. "Now." Sophie laughed, a brittle, nervous sound that echoed in the hush. "You think you're some big shot?" she spat, crossing her arms to hide the tremble in her hands. "Go ahead, call the captain. See if he cares about your little tantrum." She turned away, pretending to adjust her tray. But her pulse hammered in her ears. She didn't see it, not yet, but Lydia wasn't bluffing. She lifted her phone, the screen flashing with a new message. And Sophie caught only a glimpse of the name attached. James Carver, CEO. The text below it was short, chilling. "Watch the video. Handle it." Hannah stepped back, her breath catching as she realized what was happening. The businessman in 3A leaned forward, his voice low and urgent. "You're done, lady," he muttered, just loud enough for Sophie to hear. The mother in 4B clutched her child tighter, glaring daggers. And Lydia? She sat back down, crossed her legs, and waited. The red dot on her phone still blinking like a heartbeat counting down Sophie's fate. In the galley, Hannah pressed herself against the counter, her mind racing. She'd seen Sophie push boundaries before, snide comments, petty power plays, but this was a disaster. And as the intercom crackled overhead, summoning the captain to first class, Hannah knew one thing for certain. Sophie had just poured her career down the drain, one spilled drink at a time. The first-class cabin felt like a pressure cooker about to blow. The air was thick with tension, the kind that prickled against your skin and made every whisper sound like a shout. Water from the shattered bottle glistened on the carpet, soaking into the edges of designer shoes and dripping off tray tables. Passengers craned their necks, some filming with their phones. others muttering in disbelief. The child in 4B whimpered softly, her mother still glaring at Sophie Nguyen like she'd just set fire to the plane. And at the center of it all stood Lydia Tran, her soaked sweater clinging to her frame, her expression as unyielding as granite. The red dot on her phone pulsed like a warning light, and Sophie, chest heaving, uniform speckled with water, knew she'd crossed a line she couldn't uncross. The intercom crackled to life, slicing through the chaos like a knife. "This is Captain Daniel Reese. Flight attendants, secure the cabin. I'm on my way." His voice was steady, authoritative, the kind of tone that could calm a storm, or signal its arrival. Sophie's stomach dropped. She spun toward the galley, her hands trembling as she gripped the edge of her tray, the overturned mimosa glass rolling lazily against her fingers. The captain? For this? She forced a laugh sharp and brittle, trying to shake off the dread clawing up her spine. "Fine," she muttered under her breath. "Let's see what he does about a spilled drink." But deep down, she knew this wasn't about the drink, not anymore. It was about the bottle she'd smashed, the words she'd spat, the way she turned a simple request into a battlefield. And that phone in Lydia's hand, recording every second of her unraveling? That was the real weapon. Sophie stole a glance at Lydia, expecting a smirk, a flicker of triumph, but Lydia just sat there, calm as ever. Her eyes locked on the aisle where the captain would soon appear. Hannah hovered near the galley, her knuckles white around the counter's edge. She'd seen Sophie's temper flare before, snapping at trainees, icing out passengers she didn't like, but this was different. This was reckless, public, and now the captain was involved. Hannah's gaze darted to Lydia, then back to Sophie, her mind racing. She tried to fix things, to bring the water, but Sophie had turned it into a spectacle. And that message on Lydia's phone, the one from the CEO, Hannah hadn't seen it clearly, but the way Lydia held herself said everything. This wasn't just a passenger. This was someone who could end them all. The cockpit door swung open with a soft thud, and Captain Reese stepped into the cabin. He was a broad-shouldered man in his late 40s, his uniform crisp, his face etched with the kind of quiet authority that didn't need to shout. Behind him trailed a second figure, taller, leaner, dressed not in a pilot's jacket but a dark suit, Marcus Tate, the air marshal. His presence sent a ripple through the cabin, passengers shifting uneasily in their seats. An air marshal didn't show up for spilled drinks. Sophie's throat tightened, her bravado evaporating like mist. Reese stopped at seat 1A, his eyes flicking from the orange juice stain on Lydia's sweater to the shattered bottle on the floor. "Miss Tran," he said, his voice low but firm. "I understand there's been an issue." It wasn't a question, it was a statement, laced with a weight Sophie didn't fully grasp yet. Lydia nodded once, setting her phone down on the armrest, the screen still glowing with that damning video. "Yes, Captain," she replied, her tone smooth as glass. "I'd like it handled." Sophie stepped forward, her voice pitching higher than she intended. "Captain, this is ridiculous. She asked for water, and I offered her something better. Then she got all high and mighty and I slipped, okay? It was an accident." She gestured wildly at the mess, her hands shaking now. "And that bottle? That was just frustration. She's making a mountain out of a molehill." Reese turned to her, his gaze cutting through her like a laser. "An accident?" he repeated, his voice dangerously quiet. He pointed at the floor. "That's an accident?" Then at Lydia's soaked clothes. "That's an accident?" Sophie opened her mouth, but nothing came out. The air marshal shifted his weight, his hand resting lightly on his hip, too close to his holster for comfort. Reese didn't wait for her to recover. "Step aside, Nguyen. Now." Before Sophie could protest, Lydia spoke again, her words dropping like stones into still water. "Captain, I'd like her to apologize. Here. In front of everyone." The request hung in the air, cold and unyielding. A few passengers gasped. The businessman in 3A leaned forward, a grim smile tugging at his lips. The mother in 4B clutched her child tighter, nodding fiercely. Sophie's face burned, her pulse hammering in her ears. Apologize? In front of them? She'd spent 7 years building her reputation, sharp, untouchable, in control, and now this woman wanted her to grovel? Reese didn't hesitate. "You heard her," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. "Do it." Sophie's legs felt like jelly, but she forced herself to turn toward Lydia. Her hands clenched into fists, nails digging into her palms as she choked out the words. "I'm sorry," she muttered, barely audible. Her eyes fixed on the floor. The cabin stayed silent, the weight of her humiliation pressing down like a physical force. "Louder," Lydia said, her voice cutting through the hush. "And look at me." Sophie's head snapped up, her eyes blazing with defiance, but it crumbled under Lydia's stare. She swallowed hard, her throat raw, and tried again. "I'm sorry," she said, louder this time, her voice cracking on the last word. The businessman clapped once, a slow, mocking sound that echoed in the stillness. The woman in the blazer smirked, her phone still rolling. Sophie's face was a furnace, shame and rage boiling together as she stood there exposed. Rhys nodded, but there was no satisfaction in it, just procedure. "Back to the galley, Nguyen. You're done up here." He turned to Marcus, the air marshal. "Keep an eye on her." Sophie stumbled back, her heels catching on the wet carpet, her mind spinning. "Done up here? What does that mean?" She wanted to argue, to scream that this wasn't fair. But the air marshal's shadow loomed behind her, a silent threat that kept her mouth shut. As she retreated, Hannah stepped forward, her voice trembling but firm. "Captain, I saw it all." She refused the water, spilled the drink on purpose, then threw the bottle. I tried to help, but..." She trailed off, glancing at Sophie with a mix of pity and resolve. Rhys raised a hand, silencing her. "Noted low. We'll handle it." Lydia picked up her phone again, her fingers swift as she tapped the screen. Sophie caught a glimpse, just a flash, before Lydia set it down. "Escalate. Now." The message was gone in an instant, but it hit Sophie like a punch to the gut. She didn't know who it was to, not yet, but the weight of it sank into her bones. She'd messed with the wrong person, and the captain's next words confirmed it. "Nguyen," Rhys said, his voice low and final. "You're confined to the rear jump seat for the rest of this flight. When we land, you're off the plane permanently. Orders from the top." He didn't elaborate, didn't need to. The air marshal stepped closer, his hand still on his hip, and Sophie felt the walls of her world cave in. She staggered toward the back of the plane, the eyes of every passenger burning into her like hot coals. The businessman muttered good riddance as she passed. The mother in 4B shielded her child's face as if Sophie were a monster. And Lydia? She sat back down, crossing her legs, the faintest hint of a smile tugging at her lips. Not triumph, not yet, but something colder. Something final. In the galley, Hannah watched her go, her heart pounding. She didn't know the full story, not yet, but she knew one thing. Sophie's reign was over. And as the plane droned on through the night, the real storm was just beginning. The plane descended through the night, the faint glow of New York skyline creeping into view through the oval windows. At 37,000 feet, then 30,000, then 20,000. The cabin buzzed with the restless energy of passengers eager to stretch their legs, grab their bags, and escape the metal tube they'd called home for 18 hours. But for Sophie Nguyen, strapped into the cramped jump seat at the rear of the plane, every foot of descent felt like a step closer to the gallows. Her uniform, once a symbol of her ironclad control, clung to her damp skin. The water stains from her outburst now joined by a cold sweat that wouldn't stop. Her hands gripped the armrests, knuckles white, as the reality of Captain Rhys's words looped in her mind. "When we land, you're off the plane permanently." The air marshal, Marcus Tate, stood a few feet away, his shadow looming over her like a jailer. He hadn't said a word since escorting her back here. But his presence was a chain she couldn't shake. The other flight attendants moved around her, setting up for landing, trays clattering, seatbelts checked, but none met her eyes. Not even Hannah, who'd stayed up front, her quiet defiance still burning in Sophie's memory. They all knew. The whispers had spread through the crew like wildfire. Sophie had screwed up, and not just a little. She torched her career in a blaze of orange juice and shattered plastic. The intercom dinged, and Rhys's voice filled the cabin, steady as ever. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're beginning our final descent into JFK. Please ensure your seatbelts are fastened and your tray tables stowed. Flight attendants, prepare for landing." The words were routine, meaningless to most, but to Sophie they were a death knell. She glanced toward the first-class curtain, half expecting to see Lydia Tran peering back at her, gloating. But the curtain stayed shut. And somehow that was worse, Lydia didn't even need to watch her fall. The plane jolted as the landing gear deployed, the engines roaring as the tires kissed the runway with a sharp screech. Passengers clapped lightly, a habit Sophie had always rolled her eyes at. "What, you're surprised we didn't crash?" But now, the sound felt like mockery. The aircraft taxied to the gate. slowing to a stop, and with a final ding, the seatbelt sign blinked off. People surged to their feet, stretching, chattering, reaching for overhead bins. Sophie stayed frozen, her breath shallow. Her mind racing for a way out. Maybe I can talk to Reese. Maybe I can explain. Maybe? Nguyen. Marcus's voice cut through her thoughts, low and unyielding. Let's go. He stepped aside, gesturing toward the aisle. Sophie's legs trembled as she stood, her heels wobbling on the carpet. She wanted to run back to the galley out the emergency exit. Anywhere but forward, but there was no escape. She straightened her spine, forcing a shred of dignity into her posture, and started the walk. The aisle stretched out like a gauntlet. Passengers from economy parted for her, some curious, others indifferent, but as she crossed into first class, the air shifted. Heads turned. Eyes narrowed. The businessman in 3A smirked. His tablet now tucked under his arm as he muttered to his seatmate, "Told you she was done." The mother in 4B clutched her daughter's hand, shooting Sophie a look of pure venom. The woman in the blazer held up her phone, still filming, her lips curling into a satisfied grin. Sophie's face burned, her pulse hammering so loud she could barely hear the rustle of bags being pulled from bins. Then she saw her. Lydia Tran stood at the front of the cabin, near the open jetway door. Her soaked sweater replaced by a dry jacket one of the crew must have fetched. She didn't look at Sophie, not yet, just spoke quietly to Captain Reese, who nodded beside her. Beyond them, in the jetway, 2 men in crisp suits waited, their expressions carved from stone. Airline executives, Sophie realized, her stomach twisting into a knot. And behind them, a security officer in a high-vis vest, his hand resting on a pair of handcuffs clipped to his belt. Sophie's steps faltered, but Marcus nudged her forward, his presence a silent command. She reached the door, the cool terminal air hitting her like a slap, and that's when Lydia turned. Her eyes met Sophie's, dark and unreadable, and she spoke, softly but loud enough for the cabin to hear. "You thought I didn't belong here," she said, her voice a blade wrapped in velvet. "Guess we'll see who's left standing." Before Sophie could respond, a sharp crackle echoed through the terminal PA system, freezing her in place. "Attention all passengers and crew at Gate 17. A voice boomed, crisp and official. Flight attendant Sophie Nguyen has been terminated from employment with this airline effective immediately due to unprofessional conduct and violation of safety protocols. She will be escorted from the premises. The words hit like a sledgehammer. Passengers gasped, some pulling out phones to record the moment. The businessman clapped again, louder this time, joined by a scattering of others. Sophie's knees buckled, but Marcus caught her arm, steadying her with a grip that felt more like a shackle. "Move," he said, his tone flat. And she had no choice but to obey. The executive stepped forward, one holding a tablet, the other a single sheet of paper. "Sophie Nguyen," the first said, his voice clipped. "Your credentials." He didn't wait for her to unclip her badge. She'd already lost it in the chaos of her retreat. He tapped the tablet, logging her out of the system with a few swift strokes, while the second handed her the paper. Termination notice. Misconduct. Immediate effect. Sophie's hand shook as she took it, the ink blurring before her eyes. Then the security officer moved in, his cuffs glinting under the terminal lights. "Turn around," he said, his voice gruff. Sophie's breath hitched. "What?" "No, but he didn't wait. He grabbed her wrists, twisting them behind her back with practiced ease, and the cold metal clicked shut around them. A murmur rippled through the crowd, passengers, crew, even a few airport staff who'd wandered over to watch. "Throwing that bottle was a safety violation," he said, loud enough for everyone to hear. "You're coming with us." Sophie's world tilted. She stumbled as he pulled her toward the gate, her heels scraping the floor, her head spinning. Faces blurred past her, Hannah wide-eyed in the jetway, clutching a water bottle like a lifeline. Reese, his jaw tight with disappointment, the executives already turning away as if she were nothing. And Lydia, standing at the edge of the scene, arms crossed, watching with that same icy calm. She didn't gloat, didn't cheer, just watched, as if Sophie's fall was a formality she'd known all along. The terminal doors loomed ahead, glass panels reflecting the chaos behind her. Passengers filmed, their voices a dull roar in her ears. She threw a bottle. Serves her right. Who was that woman? Sophie's legs gave out halfway there, but the officer hauled her up. dragging her the last few steps. The door slid open and the cold night air swallowed her whole. She collapsed onto a bench outside, the cuffs biting into her wrists. The termination notice crumpled in her lap. Her phone buzzed in her pocket once, twice, a dozen times, but she couldn't reach it. She didn't need to. She knew what they'd say: you're done. You're viral. You're nothing. 7 years of climbing, controlling, commanding gone in a single flight. And as the plane's engines roared to life for its next journey without her, Sophie realized the truth. Lydia Tran hadn't just taken her job. She'd taken everything. The night air outside JFK Terminal 4 was sharp and biting, cutting through Sophie Nguyen's damp uniform like 1,000 tiny knives. She sat hunched on a metal bench near the pickup zone, the handcuffs gone but their weight still lingering on her wrists, red welts marking where the steel had bitten into her skin. The crumpled termination notice lay in her lap, its edges curling in the wind, the words misconduct. Immediate effect, smeared by her sweaty fingers. Her phone buzzed relentlessly in her pocket. A swarm of notifications she couldn't bring herself to check. She didn't need to. She knew what they'd say. She knew what she'd become. The airport thrummed around her. Taxis honking. Suitcases rolling, families reuniting with tired hugs and sleepy smiles. Travelers streamed past, their lives moving forward while hers had ground to a halt. No one stopped. No one looked. To them, she was just another disheveled woman in a wrinkled uniform, a ghost of someone who used to matter. The irony twisted in her gut like a blade. For 7 years, she'd walked these terminals with her head high, her badge gleaming, her authority unquestioned. Now she couldn't even step back inside. She was banned, erased. A nobody in a place that had once been her kingdom. Her breath hitched, a shaky exhale fogging in the cold. She pulled her coat tighter. The airline logo on her bag staring up at her like a cruel joke. She traced it with a trembling finger, the same bag she'd hauled through countless flights, packed with pride and purpose. Now it was just fabric, worn at the edges, as empty as she felt. The roar of a jet engine overhead jolted her, and she glanced up, catching the tail of the plane she just left as it taxied away for its next trip. Without her, the thought sank into her chest, heavy and final. She fumbled for her phone, the screen lighting up with a flood of notifications, texts, emails, social media tags. Her hands shook as she swiped it open, and the first thing she saw was a video thumbnail. Herself mid-rant, hurling the water bottle in first class. The caption above it read, "Flight attendant meltdown goes viral. You won't believe what she did." The views were already in the hundreds of thousands, climbing by the second. Comments poured in like acid rain. What a psycho. Entitled much? Hope she never flies again. Her stomach churned, ball rising in her throat as she scrolled. Another video, from the woman in the blazer, showed her being cuffed and dragged out, the PA announcement booming in the background. Terminated for unprofessional conduct. The sound echoed in her skull over and over. Messages from colleagues, former colleagues, flashed next. "Sophie, what the hell happened? You're trending a bad way. Union can't help. You're blacklisted." She stopped reading, her vision blurring as the screen slipped from her grip, clattering onto the bench. Blacklisted. The word was a guillotine, severing any hope of clawing her way back. 7 years of early mornings, red-eye flights, smiling through turbulence, all torched in a single moment of arrogance. She pressed her palms to her eyes, trying to block it out, but the images wouldn't stop. Lydia Tran's calm stare, the spilled juice, the shattered bottle, the cuffs clicking shut. Lydia. This was her doing. Sophie's hands curled into fists, nails digging into her palms as anger flared, hot and desperate. She'd begged, in that cabin, swallowed her pride, choked out an apology in front of everyone. And for what? Lydia hadn't blinked, hadn't softened, just sat there like a judge passing sentence. Sophie wanted to hate her, to blame her, to scream that this wasn't fair. But as the rage burned, a colder truth seeped in, dousing the flames like ice water. Lydia hadn't thrown the bottle. Lydia hadn't spilled the drink. Lydia hadn't decided who belonged and who didn't. Sophie had. She slumped back against the bench, her breath ragged, the fight draining out of her. She'd spent years reading people, judging them by their clothes, their seats, their requests. The man in 2B with his expensive suit got a warm smile and a top-shelf pour. The woman in economy with a crying kid got a curt nod and a delay on her coffee. And Lydia? Lydia got a smirk and a refusal, All because she didn't look the part. Sophie had sized her up in seconds, jeans, no bling, a simple ask, and decided she wasn't worthy. But Lydia hadn't just been worthy. She'd been the one who owned the damn plane. A bitter laugh escaped her, raw and broken, drawing a glance from a passing traveler who quickly looked away. Sophie didn't care. She saw it now, too late. It was never about the water. It was about power, hers fleeting and fragile. Lydia's quiet and absolute. Sophie had wielded hers like a club, swinging it at anyone who dared challenge her. Lydia had used hers like a scalpel, precise and devastating, cutting Sophie down without ever raising her voice. Her phone buzzed again, and this time she let it fall to the ground, the screen cracking against the pavement. She didn't pick it up. What was the point? The life she'd known was gone, her badge, her uniform, her place in the sky. She'd never walk through a crew lounge again. Never hear the hum of engines as her own. The industry wouldn't touch her now, not with that video, not with misconduct stamped across her record like a scarlet letter. She was 37, jobless and unemployable, with nothing but a bag and a broken phone to show for it. A gust of wind whipped through the terminal, tugging at her hair, and for the first time, she felt the tears, hot, silent, spilling down her cheeks. She didn't wipe them away. She let them fall, let them blur the lights of the airport into a watery haze. She thought of Hannah standing in the jetway with that water bottle, her quiet courage a mirror to Sophie's cowardice. She thought of the passengers, clapping as she was dragged out, their judgment now the world's. And she thought of Lydia, stepping off that plane untouched, untouchable, leaving Sophie to drown in the wreckage. The plane's lights faded into the distance, swallowed by the night. Sophie sat there alone, the cold seeping into her bones, the echoes of her own words ringing in her ears. Waters for economy. She'd been wrong about everything. And as the terminal emptied around her, leaving only the hum of a departing world, she realized the worst part. She'd never get the chance to be right again. The sleek black SUV idled outside JFK Terminal 4, its tinted windows reflecting the flickering lights of the airport like a dark mirror. Inside, Lydia Tran sat in the back seat, her posture as composed as it had been in seat 1 8 hours earlier. The damp sweater was long gone, replaced by a tailored blazer she'd pulled from her carry-on, a quiet armor for the world beyond the plane. Her phone rested in her hand, the screen dark now, the video she'd recorded tucked away in a secure folder. She didn't need to watch it again. She'd lived it, orchestrated it, and seen it through to the end. The driver glanced at her through the rearview mirror, his voice deferential. "Home, Ms. Tran? Or the office?" Lydia tilted her head slightly, her gaze drifting to the terminal doors where Sophie Nguyen had vanished into the night, cuffed and broken. "Home," she said finally, her tone soft but firm. "It's been a long flight." The engine purred to life, and the SUV glided away, leaving the chaos of the airport and Sophie's unraveling life behind. At 42, Lydia had built an empire in the shadows. Few knew she owned the airline, not the crew, not the passengers, not even most of the executives who'd stood at the gate to execute her orders. She liked it that way. Power didn't need a spotlight. It thrived in silence, in the spaces where people underestimated her. She'd learned that lesson young, clawing her way up from nothing, a scholarship kid in a world of trust funds. A woman in rooms full of men who thought she'd fetch their coffee. She didn't. She built her own table instead, and now she owned the room. The city light streaked past the window, a blur of gold and neon against the black. Lydia leaned back, her fingers brushing the phone as her mind replayed the flight. It hadn't started with a plan to destroy Sophie Nguyen. She'd boarded that plane as she always did, low-key anonymous, testing the machine she'd created. A glass of water wasn't a power play, it was a habit, a small ritual to ground her amid the chaos of her life. But Sophie had turned it into a battlefield, and Lydia never backed down from a fight. She could still see it, Sophie's smirk, the way her eyes had raked over Lydia's jeans and sweater, dismissing her in a heartbeat. It wasn't new. Lydia had faced that look 1,000 times, from boardroom skeptics who doubted her numbers, from gate agents who questioned her boarding pass, from people who saw her quiet demeanor and assumed it meant weakness. Sophie wasn't the first to misjudge her, but she'd been the loudest. The spill, the bottle, the tantrum, it wasn't just rudeness. It was a declaration, you don't belong. And Lydia had decided in that moment to prove her wrong. Her phone buzzed. A single notification breaking the silence. She glanced at it, a text from James Carver, the airline CEO, and her right hand, videos everywhere. When's finished? Press wants a statement. Lydia's lips curved into the faintest smile, not of triumph but of inevitability. She typed back, quick and precise, no statement. Let it stand. She didn't need to gloat. The world would do the talking for her, already was, judging by the numbers James had sent earlier. Millions of views. Sophie's name trending alongside words like meltdown and fired. The court of public opinion had convicted her before the plane's wheels even touched the ground. Did she feel sorry? The question flickered in her mind as the SUV merged onto the highway. The hum of the engine filling the quiet. Sophie had begged, after all, her voice cracking, her pride in tatters. A younger Lydia might have softened. Might have seen a shadow of her own struggles in that desperate plea. But the years had hardened her. Taught her that mercy was a luxury she couldn't afford, not when people like Sophie wielded their small power like a weapon, cutting down anyone who didn't fit their mold. Sophie hadn't just denied her water, she denied her dignity. And dignity, Lydia knew, was non-negotiable. She thought of Hannah, the young attendant who dared to defy Sophie. Her hands trembling as she set that bottle on the tray. There was something there, grit, quiet strength. Lydia made a mental note to pull her file when she reached her desk tomorrow. People like Hannah were rare, the kind who could rise if given the chance. Sophie had been given chances, 7 years of them, and she'd squandered every one. Lydia didn't destroy her career. Sophie handed her the match. The SUV slowed as it approached her penthouse, a glass tower overlooking the Hudson. The driver opened her door and she stepped out, the night air cool against her skin. She didn't look back at the car, didn't glance at the phone still buzzing with updates. She'd seen enough for one day. Inside, the elevator hummed upward, carrying her to the 47th floor, where floor-to-ceiling windows framed the city she'd conquered. She poured herself a glass of water, simple, clear, cold, and stood by the glass, staring out at the lights. Sophie would cry tonight. Lydia knew. She'd rage, she'd blame, she'd claw at the wreckage of her life. But tomorrow or the day after, she might see it, the lesson buried in the ruins. Power wasn't in a uniform or title. It was in how you treated people and the choices you made when you thought no one was watching. Sophie had chosen poorly and the world had watched. Lydia took a sip, the water sharp against her tongue, and set the glass down. She didn't need to check the news, didn't need to hear the chatter. The story was done, hers kept going. Tomorrow, she'd board another flight, sit in another seat, ask for another glass of water. And somewhere, someone else would decide if they saw her or just the shadow she cast. She smiled faintly, a flicker of anticipation in her eyes. Let them try. The city stretched out below, vast and unyielding, and Lydia Tran stood above it all, calm, quiet, and untouchable. The fluorescent lights of the cheap motel room buzzed faintly, casting a sickly glow over the peeling wallpaper and stained carpet. Sophie Nguyen sat on the edge of the sagging bed. Her once pristine uniform replaced by a wrinkled hoodie and jeans, her auburn hair falling loose and tangled around her shoulders. 3 days had passed since the flight, 3 days since the cuffs. The viral videos, the public execution of her career, but it felt like a lifetime. Her phone lay face down on the nightstand, its cracked screen silent now after she'd turned it off to escape the endless notifications. The world hadn't stopped talking about her, but she'd stopped listening. Almost. Her bag, the one with the airline logo, sat open on the floor, spilling its contents. A spare uniform she'd never wear again. A half-empty bottle of water she'd grabbed from a gas station. A crumpled boarding pass from her last flight. She stared at it all, her hands clenched in her lap, nails digging into her palms until they left crescent-shaped marks. She'd checked out of her apartment yesterday, couldn't afford the rent without a paycheck, and this motel with its $50 a night rate was all she had left. 7 years of climbing the ranks, gone. 7 years of strutting through airports, gone. 7 years of control snatched away by a woman with a phone and a glass of water. But Sophie wasn't done, not yet. She'd spent the last 72 hours spiraling, crying, cursing, staring at the ceiling as the videos racked up millions of views, but something had shifted this morning. Anger had clawed its way past the shame, a raw, jagged thing that refused to let her sink quietly. She wouldn't let Lydia Tran win. Not completely, for her career was dead. She'd at least take back her story. She'd fight, even if it was the last thing she did. She grabbed her phone, powering it on with trembling fingers. The screen flared to life. A flood of missed calls and texts pouring in, colleagues, reporters, strangers who'd tracked her down. She ignored them, opening a browser instead. Her name was still trending, the headlines brutal. Flight attendant fired after viral meltdown. Sophie Nguyen, the face of airline arrogance. Her chest tightened, but she scrolled past, searching for something, anything she could use. Then she saw it. A local news station, NYC Live, was hosting a segment tomorrow morning, The Power of One, how a single passenger took down a flight attendant. A guest spot was open. A chance to speak. Sophie didn't hesitate. She dialed the number listed, her voice hoarse but steady as she pitched herself to the producer. I'm Sophie Nguyen. I was on that flight. I want to tell my side. The producer paused, then chuckled. A sound that made her skin crawl. You're a hot ticket right now. Be here at 8 a.m. sharp. The line clicked dead. And Sophie let out a shaky breath. This was it, her shot to rewrite the narrative, to explain, to claw back some shred of dignity. The next morning, she stood outside the NYC Live studio, the cold biting at her fingertips as she adjusted her hoodie. She tried to tame her hair, splash water on her face, look like the polished professional she'd once been. But the mirror had betrayed her. Dark circles, hollow eyes, a shadow of the woman who'd ruled first class. She pushed through the glass doors anyway. Her heart pounding as a production assistant rushed her into makeup. 5 minutes, the assistant barked, shoving her into a chair. The brush swiped over her face like a weapon, painting over the wreckage. The studio lights blazed as she stepped onto the set. The host, a slick man named Greg Tanner, grinning at her like a shark smelling blood. Welcome, Sophie Nguyen, he said, his voice booming over the live audience's murmurs. The internet's been on fire about you. Care to tell us what really happened on that flight? The crowd leaned in, a mix of curiosity and judgment in their eyes. Sophie swallowed, her throat dry, and launched into her story, carefully rehearsed, polished just enough to sound human. I made a mistake, she started, her voice steady at first. I misjudged a passenger, Lydia Tran. I thought she was difficult, out of place. I refused her water, yes, and things got out of hand. I spilled a drink, I lost my temper. I threw a bottle. But I didn't mean for it to go this far. I've worked 7 years for that airline, given everything, and one bad moment shouldn't define me. She paused, forcing a tremble into her voice, a crack of vulnerability. I'm not a monster. I'm just human. The audience softened, a few nodding, and for a fleeting second, Sophie felt it, hope. Greg tilted his head, his smile thinning. Human, sure. But that video, millions saw you snap. And word is, Lydia Tran wasn't just any passenger. Sources say she owns the airline. Care to comment? Sophie's stomach dropped, but she rallied. I didn't know that. If I had, I'd have. She stopped, realizing the trap too late. Greg pounced. So you'd have treated her better if you'd known she was powerful? What about everyone else? Before she could answer, the studio doors swung open and the air shifted. A murmur rippled through the crowd as Lydia Tran stepped in, unannounced, her presence slicing through the room like a blade. She wore a sleek gray suit, her hair swept back. Every inch the Titan Sophie hadn't seen on that plane. Greg's eyes lit up. Well, folks, looks like we've got a surprise guest. Lydia Tran, welcome. Sophie froze, her breath catching as Lydia crossed the set, her heels clicking with quiet authority. The audience erupted, gasps, applause, phone snapping photos. Lydia didn't acknowledge them, her gaze locking on Sophie with that same calm, piercing stare. I heard you were telling your side, she said, her voice smooth and deadly. Mind if I tell mine? Greg gestured to a chair, grinning. Please, Miss Tran, the floor's yours. Sophie's hands clenched, her pulse racing as Lydia sat, crossing her legs with effortless grace. Sophie's right about one thing, Lydia began. Her tone measured. It was one moment, but it wasn't about water. It was about respect or the lack of it. She looked at me, decided I didn't belong, and treated me like I was beneath her. I don't destroy careers lightly, but I don't tolerate that. Not on my plane. The audience murmured, some clapping, others glaring at Sophie. She opened her mouth to argue. That's not fair. But Lydia cut her off, her voice rising just enough to silence the room. You had 7 years to learn, Sophie. 7 years to see people, not just seats. You didn't. That's why you're here. And I'm still flying. The words landed like a punch and Sophie felt the air leave her lungs. Greg leaned in, sensing blood. So Sophie, what now? You've lost everything, job, reputation. Any regrets? She stared at Lydia, then at the crowd, their faces a blur of judgment. I regret not seeing, she whispered, the admission tearing out of her like glass. But I'll fight to come back. I'm not done. Lydia's lips curved, a flicker of a smile, not cruel, not kind, just knowing. Good luck, she said, standing and walking off the set, her silhouette vanishing through the doors. The audience erupted again, Greg wrapping up with a smug, well, there you have it, folks. But Sophie barely heard. She sat there alone under the lights. The weight of Lydia's words crushing her last spark of defiance. Outside, the city roared on, indifferent. Sophie stepped into the cold, her hoodie no match for the wind. Her future a blank slate she didn't know how to fill. Lydia was right, she hadn't seen. But now she did, and it was too late. Or was it? She lifted her chin, a flicker of something stubbornness. Maybe hope, flaring in her chest. The fight wasn't over. Not yet. And there you have it, folks, the tale of Sophie Nguyen, the flight attendant who flew too close to the sun and crashed harder than a budget airline's landing gear on a windy day. From strutting down the aisle like she owned the sky to slinking out of JFK in handcuffs, her story's a wild ride, isn't it? But let's not just point and laugh, well, maybe a little. Because who doesn't love a good I told you so moment? No, seriously, there's a lesson here, and it's not just don't throw water bottles at 35,000 feet unless you want your career to take a nosedive. Think about it. Sophie's epic faceplant wasn't really about a glass of water, or even Lydia Tran's quiet as a ninja billionaire vibes. It was about how quick we are to judge a book by its cover, or passenger by her jeans. In 2025, with TikTok trials and Twitter takedowns happening faster than you can say, cancel culture. Sophie's story feels ripped from our daily scroll. Ever snapped at someone online because they didn't look like they belonged? Ever assumed you're the big shot in the room, only to find out the quiet one in the corner's got the keys to the kingdom? Yeah, we've all been Sophie at some point, maybe minus the viral meltdown and the cuffs, but you get the drift. Here's the kicker. Lydia didn't win because she had money or fancy title hidden up her sleeve. She won because she saw what Sophie didn't. People aren't props in your personal power play. So next time you're tempted to flex on someone, whether it's at work, on a plane, or in the comments section, maybe pause and ask, is this worth my whole life going up in flames over a petty, I'm better than you moment? Spoiler alert. It's probably not. Unless you're auditioning for the next viral villain, in which case, carry on. And send us the footage. So what do you think? Was Sophie a victim of her own ego? Or did Lydia's ice-cold revenge take it too far? Could you see yourself in either of their shoes? Or would you be Hannah, quietly sipping tea in the galley while the drama unfolds? Drop your thoughts in the comments, we're dying to hear. And hey, if you love this roller coaster of a story, or just enjoyed watching Sophie crash and burn, don't forget to like, share, and hit that subscribe button. We've got more tales coming your way. Some with less handcuffs, some with even more chaos. Where are you tuning in from today? Tell us below, and let's keep the conversation flying high.